There's been an increase in interest in understanding the potential climatic impacts on economic outcomes in recent years, and a lot of this literature is very much a much more macro scale. And so what really interested me was trying to understand how these impacts can happen at a more micro level, and how that can affect individual well-being and decision-making in particular. In the context of a developed country, I mean, we're obviously very concerned about the impact that climate change will have in developing countries. They're most likely to be affected more by climate change than developed countries, and so there's welfare implications about the impact that climate change might have there. So in terms of understanding these impacts, the majority of the literature on looking at climatic influence on economic outcomes has focused on sort of ex-post impacts, the impacts of natural disasters, the impact of shocks. But we also know that climate change, in addition to increasing these shocks, and there's likely to be an increase in variability as well, in rainfall, in sort of seasonal weather fluctuations as well. And so we want to understand some of the ex-ante, the sort of ex-ante welfare implications as well. And so the focus of this paper is really thinking about how future income uncertainty, which we proxy using climate variability, which is beyond 1 year, we look at 5 years and 10 years variability, sort of a historical volatility in rainfall, and how that affects decision-making in the context of human capital investments, and the sort of trade-off that might have in terms of decision-making on the farm, in the household, related to child labour. So in that respect, we want to understand how expectations about future states of the world might affect this decision-making from a sort of risk management perspective, as well as a sort of human capital accumulation story. Well, interestingly, so the World Bank in their World Development Report back in 2010 made a strong argument that climate change is likely to disproportionately affect women and children. Although this is more of a prior than evidence to suggest this, there's very little evidence on the ground to provide this sort of substantive argument for this, and so this is what interested me in looking at this question in the first place. We might expect that climate change would increase child labour based on this conjecture, and have a negative impact on schooling, but it's very much a two-sided hypothesis. This relates to the fact that increased variability, increased uncertainty about future income could increase education, because households want their children to be sort of moving out of the farm and into sectors of the economy which are less affected by climate, or it could increase child labour and reduce educational investments, as households want to invest more in risk management strategies. Children are used a lot on the farm in Ethiopia, and so in that respect they might be trying to sort of mitigate the potential damages that future shocks might happen. So in that respect it's very nice from a research perspective, because we have two hypotheses and we can sort of test either side. In terms of the impact on child labour, we find that there is an increase in child labour on the farm. We look at the intensive margin and the extensive margin. So by the intensive margin I mean the number of hours that children are working in different activities. The extensive margin relates to whether they participate in child labour in these activities at all, and also the impact, the enrolment in school and the grades attained in school. And in this respect we find that there's an increase in child labour on the farm, a reduction in child labour in the home. And this seems to indicate that there is some sort of substitution of time allocation within the household. And what's very interesting about this is it comes down to an accounting exercise, effectively. If you live in an area with more climate variability and you want to address this sort of the potential future shocks using risk management strategies, then if you need to increase the child labour on the farm by 10 hours, then you maybe shift that out of your education, or you shift it out of other activities. And what we find is that a lot of the impact happens on this intensive margin, this reallocation of time within child labour. So it's really important to sort of, when you're looking at child labour, to sort of think about the different activities as opposed to the total effect. The total effect we find is basically zero, there's a net zero effect. The impact on education, we don't find any effect because of this. It's an accounting exercise. No. The total impact on child labour is sort of shuffled around within the activities these children are already engaged in, and because of that, at least in the formal sense of education, we don't see any potential damages. And this is particularly interesting because of the policy debate around child labour and the potential impacts on education and human capital accumulation. Jim Heckman earlier in the week was discussing dynamic complementarities, how learning begets learning. And if there are sort of early impacts on education of these children, that means that can have generational impacts. There's strong evidence to suggest that parental education is a strong determinant of child education, and so if they grow up with less education, then their children may have less education, and you end up in a sort of a poverty trap in that respect. So this is, I think, one of the most interesting contributions of the paper, that we find that there isn't this impact on education, and that they can actually adjust within the household this impact on child labour. The sort of supporting evidence to go along this, though, I mean, given that it's an accounting exercise, is that if we believe that households are trying to spread the burden of child labour across their children, which seems to be what the data is suggesting, if there are not enough children to spread that burden, then we might expect to see impacts on education. There are a lot of endogeneity concerns here, and so a lot of the work that I'm doing now on the paper is trying to uncover these a little bit more and work hard at trying to deal with these issues in order to make more of a causal inference here. But from the the supporting evidence to suggest that children who don't have any siblings are affected by increased variability in education. This can be thought of if you have 10 hours additional labour needed and you have 5 children, that's 2 hours each. If you only have 1 child, that's very likely to impact on their educational investments. So in that respect, it's initial results on the supporting evidence, but other work that I've been doing in relation to that seems to suggest that might be what happens as well.